Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, looters, shields, legislators, peasants, vassals, lobbyists, scumbags, lawyers, scumbags, legislators, scumbags. I'm a useful idiot, and I've mentioned in other videos about how corporations actually write our legislation. And a lot of people don't know that I mean that quite literally. And I'm about to talk about an organization today that is exactly that. It's called the American Legislative Exchange Council. And this is an organization that's completely corporate funded. In fact, its corporate board consists of the likes of AT&T, Bayer, Coca-Cola, ExxonMobil, GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, Koch Industries, Pfizer, Kraft Foods, State Farm Insurance, Walmart, UPS. 300 different corporations. And they all contribute to this, what is called the American Legislative Exchange Council. And what happens is corporations write, and these lobbyists write this model legislation, what they call model legislation, for all the different major industries. And then this corporations pay to bring legislators to one place, sit them down for a sales pitch on policies that benefit corporations' bottom line, and then push these model bills for legislators to turn into law. So that's quite literally how it works. We have essentially a brokerage that has hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of completely written legislation geared for the specific needs of all these corporations, like the ones that I listed. And it's all put into a brokerage, and then this brokerage arranges meetings between its representatives, lobbyists, and state legislators, as well as national legislators. And then they sell them on these corporate written bills. And this came up recently because, as it turns out, Obama approved a fracking chemical fluid disclosure on public lands bill. And it was exactly the model bill written by ExxonMobil and delivered to the government by the American Legislative Exchange Council. And it was called the, quote, Disclosure of Hydraulic Fracturing Fluid Composition Act, unquote. And it was word for word. In fact, I think it was 80 to 90% exactly as ExxonMobil had written it. And that's what Obama used as a piece of legislature for fracking chemical fluid. So you can see where we're going to get the absolute truth about what is in hydraulic fracturing fluid, since ExxonMobil is behind the legislation. But anyway, let me get back to this organization, the American Legislative Exchange Council. They have 32 staffers and a $7 million budget. And $1 million they use for what they call travel scholarships. And that is when they actually pay these legislators to go to these task force meetings, is what they call them. And so this clearinghouse for legislation actually has a budget that they use to pay for legislators to be flown to these task force meetings. And that's where legislators and corporate lobbyists actually vote. So they get together, lobbyists and legislators, our government, and they vote on proposed model legislation. This is closed to the press and the public. So they vote on which model legislation they would be willing to both sign in on. And then it goes into this bank, and then they just, this clearinghouse, and then they just pull it out when they need to address something. And as it turns out, through the Freedom of Information Act, there's now 200 model bills, templates that are now made to the public on the website of the American Legislative Exchange Council. And they address every issue that can conceivably come up before our legislators, whether it's charter schools, climate, education, unions, right to work, workplace drug testing, cable television, warning labels, toll roads, land use, you name it. So the corporations have basically written out legislation to address everything that affects all of us. And this is where our legislators go. Our local Congress, our local legislators as well as our national legislators, this is where they go, and that's why they don't read any of this legislation, and that's why they don't write any of this legislation, and that's why they're always full of surprises, because as it turns out, corporations are writing our legislation. Literally, they are writing our legislation. And this, unfortunately, as it turns out, as a conservative, I'm showing the fact that I'm fairly objective, because as it turns out, the primary users of the American Legislative Exchange Council are Republicans. And I'm sorry to report that. I wish the Democrats were in on this one. But as it turns out, their featured speakers are the likes of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Dan Quayle, John Ashcroft, Newt Gingrich, Trent Lott, all Republicans. Their alumni include Donald Rumsfeld, John Boehner, Tom DeLay, all Republicans. These are all people who have worked for the American Legislative Exchange Council at some point. And while there's one anecdote actually in this one article I read, and it says, while legislators can bring proposed bills, so theoretically through this exchange, legislators can also bring model legislation, but they don't. It all comes from corporations, and this is borne out by a Florida teacher. She was a representative of the teachers union, and she attended, and she said the majority of proposed model bills I saw came from corporations. And but it's kind of funny, because a spokesman from the American Legislative Exchange Council noted that a piece of model legislation passed by the task force still must be approved by the 22-person board of directors. And well, as it turns out, all 22 people on the board of directors are all state legislators and all Republicans. So as it turns out, this little bill mill, as they call them, is all Republicans, and I'm sorry to have to say that. Over 800 bills and resolutions voted for by corporations have been ratified by the American Legislative Exchange Council legislators. So over 800 bills and resolutions have already made their way through. And ALEC brags that and that's the abbreviation ALEC for the American Legislative Exchange Council. They brag that over 1,000 of its model bills get introduced in state houses each year. So there's more evidence of what we already knew. 1,000 model bills written by corporations are introduced into state houses each year. And the American Legislative Exchange Council spends about $600,000 a year on what they call, quote, recruitment and retention of ALEC state legislators and members. So in other words, they spend $600,000 a year just bribing and recruiting and using money to retain state legislators who have signed on to the American Legislative Exchange Council. And when I mentioned earlier they have these task force meetings, well, it turns out, just like all the other corporations and just like our own government, when they talk about task forces, they're talking about conventions where there's luncheons and dinners and golf outings and skeet shooting and boat rides and cigar parties. And oftentimes they cost over $2 million at a pop. So it's just another form of lobbying. And the other funny thing about this American Legislative Exchange Council is that 98% of its funding comes from those very corporations. No surprise there. So they bankroll this thing, and then it has this innocuous name, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And then also all the legislatures pay dues on top of that. So the corporations pay dues, the legislators pay dues, and then 90% of all the funding comes straight from these corporations that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to go down that list one more time. Now that you know the full story of the American Legislative Exchange Council, AT&T, Bayer, Coca-Cola, ExxonMobil, GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, Koch Industries, Pfizer, Kraft Foods, State Farm Insurance, Walmart, UPS. So undoubtedly we've had lots of legislation written by those very companies that are now the law of the land in the United States, because in this country now our congressmen not only do not read legislation, they don't write legislation. We leave that to corporations. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.